Rachel and I are just going to talk a little bit about the module, just for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And I think it'd be really nice to sort of, in a way, it's a celebration of the module as well as the field of design research today. And it's fantastic to see all the work that you've all produced, or the students have produced. I'll just give you a bit of information about the module. So it's undertaken by second year Master of Architecture students, and that's the compulsory, and PhD students, but that's optional. And it's been running since 2008 as a smaller module, then expanded in 2010 to 30 credits. And we see it really as a really good introduction to writing an MA dissertation, which can convert an MArch to a true postgraduate master's. And good preparation as well for doing a PhD, because in some ways it's about kind of developing that specialism and beginning that sort of design thesis. And we also think it's really important that within RIBA Part 2 architecture qualification, that there is an element of research, and this is part of that. The ambition of the module, in relation then to the students, what comes out from the students, is really that it should be free to, or the students should be free to pursue a personal interest within architecture and design. And that's the subject matter isn't actually the concern of the brief that we set. The subject matter is total personal choice and essentially open. And the brief is really what we do is set up a structure and a framework for then that freedom to be sort of developed within. And we see it also as a real opportunity to develop a specialism that then can feed into your other design work, other modules, and an ongoing practice in a way. And in that sort of process of design researching, we hope that the module offers skills and the tools and approach to catalyse a critical practice. And I think that's we think that's a marker of excellence in architectural endeavour. I think if you look around some of the top architectural practices around the world, most of them have this sort of element of criticality within their practice, and they have a sort of a research endeavour as part of that. And we see it also that somehow relates to the work of an artist and the way that an artist develops a practice, a particular inquiry. So the ambition for the module in relation to the wider context is a contribution towards the emerging field of design research. And we position the design research as an essential ingredient within architectural education. And also, we think it's important for design research to be a method through which architects can develop new knowledge and understanding. And I think there's increasing pressure on architects to research within their discipline. And design research makes that accessible, that sort of activity accessible, whilst utilising the very particular skill set of designers. You don't have to become a researcher, you just had to extend your activity as a designer. And I think this sort of validates the creative act in relation to research. So it's not just something that is thought of as just a method. It is actually an intrinsic part of the research and the research output. And that's within that small way, that's what we aim to do within the module.
So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the module structure, which is quite amusing because there are a lot of people that have been engaged in the module structure, so you can all shout out if say, no, that's not what we did at all. But this is the way that we view it. And we thought it would be interesting, firstly, that the central task really is, as Jono said, to develop your own, an individual research project. And that's by far the hardest task in the module. It needs support and it needs an incremental assisted progression. And it relates perhaps to that idea of poiesis that was talked about earlier. And then this support that we talk about comes from a kind of a series of lectures really at the start of the module, and moves on much more to a tutorial studio-based explorations, which again, as I said, supported by tutorials. In both of those modes, it's really supported, or it's a method of co-inquiry, I suppose, through dialogue, and we very deliberately ask questions continuously throughout the process. And the idea is that collectively we'll come to a better understanding through that kind of idea of the Socratic method. And it's not just a dialogue between, I suppose, us as tutors and students, but it's also a dialogue for the student themselves between the practice that they do and the reflection against that. So we ask students to produce, to reflect, and really change their practice as a result. So it's a reflexive practice. But moving beyond, again, that idea of pure logic, it allows a back and forth between, I suppose, a very instinctive way of working and a maybe logical working. Sort of right brain thinking, left brain thinking. So we move forward in our understanding in each project that each individual takes in two ways, both through the knowledge and understanding generated in each individual project, but also through a collective discussion and understanding of what design research might be. So we're really thinking of and conceptualizing knowledge as a process rather than as a product, a moment of absolute clarity. So that outer circle might be a beginning of an idea of what we think design research might be. We begin in this process by discussing what is research and what is design research, and in discussion around Jane Rendell's article, Architectural Research and Disciplinarity, and Christopher Frayling's article, Research in Art and Design, and increasingly the design research series by Ashgate. And through this we examine probably three models: research into design, research for design, and research through or by design. And it's this latter mode that we're most concerned with. Most projects involve more than one, but it's the latter one that's kind of compulsory. And embedded within this discussion is a kind of critique and examination of what design is and what the difference between design and design research might be. So in order to make this difficult, hardest part of the project, the defining of the question, possible, we set up this kind of matrix which just defines areas of study, so the politics of public space, or materiality and spatial experiential design, as well as against that matrix three modes of inquiry, so through drawing, through test pieces, through construction, and through moving imagery. Again, it's possible to do almost anything within that, but the idea is really just to make it not seem like such a daunting task. So the key outputs that we expect as part of the process of the module, the first thing is for students to write a research proposal, so they develop their own research question or hypothesis as a starting point for design research inquiry. And within that's a theoretical context, methodology, those proposed methods, and the diagramming of the process. So we really ask students to try and make visual the processes that they think that they have gone through and that they are planning to go through. The next thing is a progress seminar where, again, we kind of force the hand. This is really from feedback from students, so we force students' hand to produce something, and so they should have 3 iterations for that seminar and develop, again, that process diagram. So there's the stuff and the reflection upon that stuff, and present to the group, and we again collectively discuss that. There's the mock exhibition and the consideration of the communication of the work in a display format, and then the final exhibition that you see here today with a equally weighted design research booklet that comes alongside that covers a lot of the process. So the work has to be communicated and has to stand up in kind of really 2 different ways. And of course, this kind of begins to suggest a linear and logical process, but the process is messy and illogical and chaotic, and chancy and contingent. And what we really ask students to do and attempt to do ourselves is, at the end of all that chaos and disorder, to try and bring order to it in order to communicate it to other people.
So as part of that as well, we have first visits and guest lectures, and we have got connections with Spike Island, and we take the students to Spike Island, which is a cultural facility which houses 70 artist studios and also a business incubator for design companies and specialist fabricators. So it's quite an interesting sort of place to visit. And also we have guest lectures. These are some of collectively, that's not just 1 year, that's sort of some of the people we've invited. And it's interesting, it's a mix of artists, designers, so we're drawing from other disciplines as well as a way of providing input within design research. So the key outcomes is to work, for the students to work speculatively, developing an exploration beyond an architectural brief, to work critically, includes that critical reflection that we demand and reflexivity, to engage in an expanded field of architecture, so it's opening up processes and transgressing what we might consider as architectural pursuit and product. And then we locate the project both within a research and a practice context. And we get the students to understand the relative significance and originality of the project. We ask them to undertake research informed by other disciplines. So that's typically probably art, film, maybe a little bit of material science, depending on the project. And then we have the whole opportunity to achieve an in-depth investigation within the design research projects. And that's about time. That's about an allocation of time on a project that gives the ability for you to have that attention, have the module credits to have the time, and have the period over the whole academic year. And I think that's absolutely vital.
So really we just wanted to end, I think, thinking about the key questions and dilemmas that have emerged through the 7 years of being involved in this module, and raise some of the questions that might come up in subsequent presentations and discussions. We just really had 3 major questions. The first intractable question is to do with the relationship between design and design research. In the early stage of the module, we discussed this and tend to identify certain kind of key issues around having an identifiable research question, which implies in itself a particular focus. Also, a transparency of the method, a communication of the method or process, such that it might be repeated by somebody else, although potentially with significantly different outcomes. And we suggest there's also something particular about design research that's perhaps more prospective than typical research or traditional research often is. We also find the Research Excellence Framework terms of significance, originality and rigour quite interesting in terms of thinking about the work. Probably we expect much of this in the design studio as well, but the case for rigour probably underpins much of what we're thinking about in the distinction between the two.
The second question is about the iterative process, and sometimes it's embodied within the final construction. And in some ways, within this, what we're sort of asking, to what extent must a research process be made explicit? To what extent should it be mapped? The steps evidenced in the communication of the project. And I think if the design research process, at least within the studio, is a dialogic process with distinct stages of development that Rachel's mentioned about the research proposal, mock exhibition, things like that, these become distilled into one single output, and the process becomes opaque. Does that matter in a way? Is it about, do we need to communicate the full process of research? or can the actual object become itself an understanding of things, an understanding of the research that's being put through.
So the final question for us is whether in the research process the author is often the evaluator of the work, and whether this really should be seen as a problem or not. It's our final question and really raises questions of an epistemological and ontological question about how we seek to validate knowledge. So whereas traditional, maybe positivist research aims to exclude the researcher from the production of knowledge and seeks an objective set of truths about the world, postmodern researchers come from a different position and argue that all knowledge is socially and culturally constructed, and that there's no such thing as objectivity, and therefore that personal subjective accounts are equally valid. And the debates that rage perhaps in these are particularly pertinent for design research, which is often self-evaluated. And we might argue, I think, that the explicit communication of the methods and the process by which the research is undertaken often lead to identification of explicit criteria based in the research question that can help to bring a level of comparability, which again can suggest a wider relevance. So, for example, the project shown here, which was a project by a student, Kirsty Pasticcio, established criteria such as the number of folds, the structural strength, the scale of the pattern, and so on. And the judging process was made explicit through that. And that would mean that somebody else could come and rejudge or make decisions about it using the same criteria. So just to close, it's been a really fascinating journey exploring design research through the module. And we're really interested to know how our reflections might relate to other people working in this area. So we would ask for questions, but I think it's much better for us to move on and invite our next speaker, Ajia, to come up.